In the first segment, you just learned about how ADH is part of one of three mechanisms that will increase blood volume and blood pressure. The other two mechanisms are the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, also known as the RAA pathway, and the sympathetic nervous system. Again, all three mechanisms, ADH, RAA, and sympathetic nervous system, are going to increase blood volume and therefore blood pressure. If these are instigated because there's a reduction in blood volume, say from a hemorrhage or dehydration, you can appreciate how all three would work in concert to bring blood volume and pressure back up toward normal. So let's now pursue further analysis of the RAA mechanism. I really think that it should be called the RAAA mechanism for renin, angiotensin II, aldosterone, and ADH pathway. Here's why. If and when there is a reduction in blood volume and therefore blood pressure, the juxtaglomerular cells that are shown here in the bottom right picture in green are going to be stimulated to release renin. The juxtaglomerular cells are found mostly around the afferent arteriole, with a little bit, as shown here in the picture, around the efferent arteriole. They detect less stretch from less blood volume going to the glomerulus. When they detect less stretch, they release renin. Renin is going to cut a blood plasma protein called angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I will circulate through the systemic blood vessels, and when it reaches the pulmonary circuit, in the pulmonary capillary beds, there is an enzyme associated with the endothelial cells. It just sort of hangs out there, and that's angiotensin converting enzyme. And it's going to cut angiotensin I into angiotensin II, which is a 8 amino acid long peptide. Angiotensin II is a powerful vasoconstrictor. So we're going to see systemic blood pressure go up, but angiotensin II within the kidney particularly targets the efferent arteriole and further accentuates its vasoconstriction. This will help dam up more blood in the glomerulus, which will help restore glomerular filtration pressure, one of the three startling forces at play at the glomerulus. In addition to the RAA pathway, you can see in this picture a sympathetic postganglionic nerve fiber that is terminally or synapsing on the juxtaglomerular cells. And this sympathetic nerve fiber can directly lead to the release of renin. So between the stretch receptors and the sympathetic nerve fiber, we can certainly get a lot of renin release, angiotensin II production, and aldosterone production. Aldosterone is primarily released through a humoral pathway, not hormonal. Aldosterone was never part of the hormonal pathway that you learned in Unit 1 between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex pathway, HPA. Aldosterone is humoral. It's either from more angiotensin II or from potassium levels. If potassium levels go up, if angiotensin II levels go up, then aldosterone levels will also go up. And aldosterone is going to target some cells in the late distal convoluted tubule called the principal cells. And this will lead to more sodium reabsorption, more water reabsorption, but comes at a price of potassium secretion. To be continued, I'm going to get there. Hold on. So, as I've already done, if and when blood volume decreases, this will lead to a decrease in blood pressure. The juxtaglomerular cells are going to detect this less stretch, less pressure, and they will secrete more renin. Renin is going to cut angiotensinogen into angiotensin I, and angiotensin I is cut by ACE angiotensin converting enzyme, which is an enzyme found in the pulmonary capillary beds. And so angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2, an 8 amino acid long peptide, octapeptide. Angiotensin 2 causes blood vessels systemically everywhere to vasoconstrict. This will help elevate blood pressure. But this is also going to help elevate blood pressure in the glomerulus and restore filtration, because angiotensin 2 is really good about targeting the efferent arteriole. Angiotensin 2 also stimulates the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa, to release aldosterone, and it also targets the hypothalamus to release ADH. Between these two other hormones, we have the following. Aldosterone will stimulate the principal cells of the late distal convoluted tubule to release more sodium, reabsorb, I should not say release, reabsorb more sodium and water, and secrete more potassium. ADH is also stimulated for release by the hypothalamus through the posterior pituitary, and ADH will target the collecting ducts and medullary ducts. And when the collecting ducts and medullary ducts are targeted by ADH, they insert more aquaporins. And more aquaporins means that you can reabsorb more water. Between these two hormones, you're going to have more water reabsorption, salt reabsorption, and that means your blood plasma osmolarity will decrease because you're reabsorbing more water, ultimately more than sodium. And your urine will become more scant and highly concentrated. When you have more water reabsorption and sodium reabsorption, your blood volume will increase and your blood pressure will also increase, thus helping to restore your filtration process at the glomerulus. So here's the RAA mechanism again, for like the 15th time. In this picture, we're starting off with a decrease in effective circulating volume. ECV is declining. E, effective, C, circulating, V, volume. That means maybe the person's bleeding out, or maybe they're dehydrating. It could be a myriad of things. But the blood plasma volume is decreasing. If that happens, follow down below to the green box. The juxtaglomerular apparatus, the juxtaglomerular cells will detect less stretch. This will lead to more renin release. That's why the plus sign is there. Renin will convert angiotensinogen, a blood plasma protein made and released by the liver, into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 will then be converted into angiotensin 2 by an enzyme found in the pulmonary capillary beds called ACE. It stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin 2 has many targets. Systemically, not shown in this picture, it will target all blood vessels of the body and cause vasoconstriction, thus restoring blood pressure and increasing the filtration process. It will also stimulate the hypothalamus to release ADH, shown here as AVP, for arginine vasopressin. That's the same thing as ADH. ADH causes the nephron to reabsorb more water. But at the same time that ADH is released, the neurons are also stimulated for thirst response. So the person starts to drink more. That's called polydipsia. Next, angiotensin 2 will cause the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone targets the nephron, specifically the late distal convoluted tubule, specifically the principal cells. There are two different cells in the late distal convoluted tubule. There are the principal cells and the alpha intercalated cells. So aldosterone will target the principal cells, and they will in turn reabsorb more sodium and water. More sodium and water reabsorption will lead to more blood volume and more blood pressure, thus restoring an increase in effective circulating volume. Here's how angiotensin II directly increases sodium and water reabsorption, not just through aldosterone. So clearly, angiotensin II stimulates the adrenal cortex to release more aldosterone, and it stimulates the hypothalamus to release more ADH. But more directly, angiotensin II also stimulates the proximal convoluted tubule to reabsorb more sodium and hence more water directly. Angiotensin II also helps constrict the efferent arterioles, and this helps to maintain or elevate GFR. So angiotensin II does a lot more than just restore GFR through targeting the efferent arterioles. It targets more water and salt reabsorption through the PCT directly. It then stimulates more aldosterone release from the zona glomerulosa, and then also stimulates the hypothalamus to release ADH. All of these mechanisms are going to help bring back more sodium and water reabsorption, retention, blood pressure is going to elevate and increase. Here's a picture of the principal cells, one of two different cells found at the late distal convoluted tubule. There are two different cells, principal and alpha intercalated cells. The alpha intercalated cells, you will hear more about that when you get your acid-base lecture in lab. But the principal cells, they respond to aldosterone, which is a steroid. And so the principal cells have the receptor for aldosterone within their cells. And when they respond to aldosterone, they insert more protein machinery. They insert more sodium potassium ATPases, which are typically found in the basolateral membrane, and they also insert more sodium leak channels on the apical membrane, and they insert more potassium leak channels on the apical membrane. If you remember, the sodium potassium ATPase allows for more sodium excretion from the cell, 3, and 2 potassium are reabsorbed into the cell. So it's a 3 to 2. We have a high potassium intracellular gradient and a low sodium intracellular gradient. We have a high sodium extracellular gradient and a low potassium extracellular gradient. So sodium would want to flow from outside to in, and potassium would want to flow from in to out. Keeping that in mind, if there are leak channels on the apical membrane, and knowing that sodium is found in high abundance in the extracellular fluid, that would mean that sodium would want to flow from the filtrate into the cell and back into the body. Similarly, if we have potassium leak channels on the apical membrane, then a high intracellular potassium gradient would favor potassium outflow, excretion, and we would urinate more potassium. So aldosterone clearly is a really good way to reabsorb more sodium and water, but secrete potassium. And this is all through the gene expression response response of the principal cells when they are exposed to aldosterone. So now let's look at the 3 pathways. If we start with a declining blood pressure, a declining blood pressure will provoke the 3 pathways that work together. We're going to get the ADH response, we're going to get the RAA response. We're going to get the direct sympathetic response. A decrease in blood pressure leads to a decrease in stretch for the baroreceptors, shown here in yellow. I'm doing the sympathetic response first. Decreased stretch means decreased action potentials up to the medulla oblongata, which will mean that there will be an increase in sympathetic response, and that will mean more vasoconstriction, more peripheral resistance, and this will help increase blood pressure. That's the fastest way to increase blood pressure. Next, a declining blood volume and pressure will mean that we're going to have a decrease in stretch detected by the juxtaglomerular cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. We're going to get an increase in renin, and renin will cut angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 1 will be converted into angiotensin 2 thanks to ACE. But renin and angiotensin 2 is also going to stimulate the sympathetic response. So all of this is working together. That's what I meant by the big red circle around the plus, joining the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidneys to the sympathetic nervous system. Once we get angiotensin 2, now we get a cascade of hormonal influence. We get 1, an increase in vasoconstriction systemically, because we're going to have more ADH release. You should write that in. Angiotensin 2 is also going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa, to release aldosterone. And aldosterone is going to lead to more sodium and water reabsorption, but it comes at a price of potassium secretion. All of these three mechanisms, and plus the purple mechanism shown on the right, where angiotensin 2, as I said correctly, leads to the release of ADH, which will target the collecting ducts and medullary ducts to release or insert more aquaporins, and we get more water reabsorption. All of these three mechanisms are going to lead to increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. The only mechanism that doesn't work in concert with those other three is the atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. Now, this hormone is released when your blood volume and pressure is too high. And it's stimulated for release when venous return is too high chronically. The atria release this ANP, and ANP causes vasodilation of the afferent arteriole. That means more blood flow arriving to the glomerulus. It also leads to vasoconstriction of the efferent arteriole. Between these two, we're going to have increased GFR because of increased glomerular hydrostatic pressure. And ANP directly targets the proximal convoluted tubule and inhibits its sodium reabsorption. And if the PCT is inhibited for sodium reabsorption, then water can't be reabsorbed. So sodium and water have to stay in the filtrate, and we get more and more urine production. ANP also inhibits the release of renin and angiotensin 2 production. It also reduces the release of ADH. So we're really seeing the floodgates opening. More glomerular filtration, more filtrate load, more GFR, more urine output, and less ability to reabsorb water at the collecting ducts and medullary ducts. This helps to minimize blood volume expansion through potent diuretic and natriuretic effects. When we come back for our next installment, we're going to talk about how the hormones ADH and aldosterone affect the kind of urine you make.